Mechanisms of Evolution, Natural Selection. It's me, Moser, and after this video, you should be able to identify the 4 conditions that must be met in order for natural selection to occur, describe the 3 ways that natural selection can change the distribution of a trait, stabilizing, disruptive, and directional selection, and give 3 definitions of species and explain how species develop. You should already be able to define evolution both in terms of shifts in distributions of characteristics and in terms of changes in allele frequency. Let's go. We know that evolution is a shift in the distribution of a trait or traits in a population, or the change in frequency of the alleles in a population. But what causes a species to evolve? How does that happen? Does it always happen the same way for the same reasons? Does it always cause the emergence of a new species? Those are good questions. I'm glad you asked. Let's start with natural selection. This is the mechanism for evolution first proposed by Charles Darwin after his travels and observations and after many years of careful thought. Natural selection works on any population if 4 conditions are met. First, that there's variation in the population. Second, that the environment presents some sort of challenge or challenges to survival. Third, that more offspring are produced than will survive to have offspring of their own. And lastly, that those individuals that do survive have some advantage, some beneficial trait that they pass on to their offspring, making those traits become more common in the population. When these 4 conditions are met, selective pressure exists, and natural selection will work on the population. Selective pressure just means that there's an advantage to some version of a trait or behavior and a disadvantage to another version of the trait or behavior. It's a cost-benefit thing. In living things, the balance of the cost, having a larger body, for instance, means needing more calories, versus the benefit, having a larger body might mean that fewer predators will be able to kill you. It means that the shape or color or whatever of the species or population that we see is the one that finds the middle ground between cost and benefit. It's important to understand that this balancing act doesn't always land us in the middle, though. As for how natural selection changes a population, there are 3 major ways natural selection can change a population: stabilizing selection, disruptive selection, and directional selection. In stabilizing selection, the average version of the trait, the median, presents some survival advantage and is selected for, while the most extreme versions of the trait have some disadvantage and are selected against. When natural selection is having a stabilizing effect on a population, the normal distribution of a trait tends to get narrower over time. A great example of stabilizing selection is birth weight in humans. While modern medical care has changed this somewhat, for most of human history, childbirth was incredibly dangerous for women and their babies. Until the last half of the 20th century and the advent of safe surgical delivery, cesarean sections, a very large baby had very little chance of being safely delivered, and its mother had very little chance of surviving the experience. Since there's a strong genetic component to birth weight, women who were genetically inclined to have larger babies, we're talking over 9 pounds here, than could be safely delivered, probably didn't pass their genes on to their offspring. Likewise, when babies are too small, they face a whole host of problems and often don't survive. The human babies most likely to survive and go on to grow up and have babies of their own, nice, healthy, medium-sized babies. Just big enough to avoid the risks of low birth weight, not so big that they die and kill their mothers in the process of delivery. Being average is awesome! When natural selection is having a disruptive effect on the population, the median, or average, is selected against, and the extreme versions of a trait are selected for. Disruptive selection is when both extremes are favored, and the middle is selected against. When disruptive selection is happening, the bell of the normal curve for whatever trait selection is working on will get shorter and wider. And in some cases, we even see the development of a bimodal distribution. Harbor seals are a good example of disruptive selection at work. Here's a harbor seal. Oh, so cute. They're just adorable. Orcas love them to eat. When you want to avoid being a predator's dinner, you pretty much have two choices. Be big and tough enough to defeat your predator, or make them afraid you will, or get away. A very small harbor seal might be small and maneuverable enough to get away from an orca, and a very large harbor seal is often big enough to at least make the orca decide to pick on someone else. As a result of this kind of disruptive selection, we find a huge range of weights in adult male harbor seals, from 120 to 300 pounds. But we find almost no seals in the middle of that range. A middle-sized seal is slower than the littlest seal, and hence more likely to be caught, but not as able to fight back as the largest seal, and hence more likely to be crunched by an orca. Being average will get you killed. In directional selection, the evolutionary pressure is in one direction. It might be that the high end of a distribution is selected for, or it could be the low end, but in either case, the opposite end is selected against. When directional selection is at work on a population, we see the entire bell move in one direction, though the shape is pretty much unchanged. The key deer is a subspecies of the very familiar white-tailed deer, and a great example of directional selection. Key deer don't look that different from whitetails, with the exception of their size. Adult male key deer stand only about 30 inches, 75 centimeters high at the shoulder, and weigh about 85 pounds on average. Compare that with our local whitetails, who may stand as high as 40 inches, roughly 100 centimeters, and weigh as much as 350 pounds. That's quite a difference. What could explain this? Islands. Remember that bigger bodies take more calories. There just aren't as many calories available on an island. So organisms that survive in greater numbers, tend to be on the smaller side of the possible range for a species. Key deer fit this trend nicely. Their ancestors who arrived on the Florida Keys were probably as large as the deer we see here in Ohio. But after generations of smaller deer surviving in higher numbers, the distribution of size in the key deer is very different from our northern whitetail. Larger key deer would be unlikely to be able to find enough calories to survive and reproduce. So we see these tiny deer. Okay, that's all fine for little shifts in how much a seal weighs or how long a rabbit's ears are. how frequent the dominant allele for fur color is, or what percentage of the population carries an allele for blue flowers. We want the real deal. New species. The process. How does evolution give us new species? The process where a new species, or two, emerges from an older species is called speciation. And in order to think about this, we'll first need to think about what we mean by the word species. The oldest definition of species was all based on morphology, or physical characteristics. Sound like a pattern we've seen elsewhere? All living things that shared some number of observable physical characteristics were considered to be one species. There are, however, a few problems with using physical observable characteristics as the basis of your definition of species. How about variation? Think about how much variation we see in humans or dogs or potatoes. You might decide based on only physical observable characteristics that these two are a different species. But they're not, right? Enter the next way humans define species, based on the production of offspring. Since basing species solely on morphology didn't work so well, we went to defining species based on the ability to breed and produce fertile offspring. This means that a horse and a horse can breed and produce offspring that's capable of reproducing. But horses and donkeys are different species, and though they can produce an offspring, that offspring, a mule, is not fertile. It can't reproduce with another mule and produce a mule. This is the biological definition of species. But there was one tool yet to come. Can you guess what it might be? Before we answer that, let's talk about those hybrids. Humans have created these non-fertile hybrids to take advantage of some characteristic of both parent species. Sometimes the hybrids are created on purpose, such as mules who blend donkey strength with horse size. And sometimes the hybrids are the result of accidental mating in captivity, such as ligers, the lion-tiger hybrids that happened on accident and became a novelty animal. So why don't these hybrids happen in nature? This leads us right back to the question of speciation. Species in nature are the result of some kind of isolation. It means that for some reason members of Group A and Group B don't mate, even if they could. There are two categories of isolation: geographic and reproductive. When the isolation is geographic, Group A and Group B have some barrier, a mountain range, a lake, or some other physical feature that prevents the members of the two groups from reaching one another. They might mate if they were put together, but they just can't get to one another. In reproductive isolation, the members of Group A and Group B might be living side by side, but there are biological roadblocks to reproduction. It could be chemical. They don't recognize one another's hormonal cues to mate. It could be timing. Group A females are ready to mate after Group B has finished mating for the year. It could be behavioral. What one group thinks is a mating display looks like prey behavior to the other group. Crunch. In either case, if the two groups are isolated for any reason for enough generations, it prevents DNA from being exchanged between the groups. With no gene flow between them, the differences in the groups may become larger and larger. This brings us to the most modern definition of species. Biologists now define a species using a little bit of each of the old criteria, physical characteristics, and the ability to produce fertile offspring. And now added to the definition is sharing some percentage of DNA, usually including specific genes. After a period of isolation, at some point, there may be enough differences between the two groups or populations, or four, that we can no longer count them as one species. That's speciation. Speciation often takes a bit longer than the simple small-scale evolution, and usually involves changes in more than one allele or trait, all happening at once. Okay, can you identify the 4 conditions that must be met in order for natural selection to occur? Can you describe the 3 ways that natural selection can change the distribution of a trait, stabilizing, disruptive, and directional? And can you give the 3 definitions of species and explain how species develop? Good, you're ready. Move on.